In 1951, there was a historic football game between Princeton and Dartmouth. And it's not historic because of the result, but because of the psychology. The game was especially rough, let's say, and there was lots of accusations of fouls by players on both sides and a lot of tension from the fans. After the game, psychologists asked the fans about what they saw, and it was as if both sides of fans had watched a completely different match. So the psychologists then decided to show a video, and it was the same video, to both students of Princeton and of Dartmouth who weren't at the game. Princeton students thought that the Dartmouth players were causing all the fouls and ruining the game, and the Dartmouth students saw the complete opposite. In some ways, this seems kind of obvious, but in other ways, it has some scary implications because instead of seeing reality as it happens, we actually selectively perceive events based on our affiliations, our loyalties, our expectations, and our interests, which is kind of a bad thing. And I'm sure you know people, for example, who sometimes aren't that bothered about a conversation, but as soon as you talk about them a little bit, they'll be very interested in listening to exactly everything you're saying. And it's really curious how our perception can just tune things out, but then hyper-focus on stuff that we really want to pay attention to. And this works across all parts of our lives, and certainly in things like politics and bigger decisions that actually impact us. The Watergate scandal, for example, was perceived very differently by fans of Nixon compared to people that didn't like him. The preceding cover-up and lack of cooperation from Nixon further enraged people that didn't like him, whilst his supporters thought that it just made sense to maintain running the country. And you can see a very similar thing going on today with Donald Trump and his criminal record. Instead of changing opinions, it's mostly just making both sides who already had their opinions more convinced that their side is correct. And before we get political here, we'll stick to the perception filter and the fact that it's more than just judging whether we like something or not. It also affects how we judge what we think will happen. Napoleon and Steve Jobs and Walt Disney all had a reality distortion field where they would see things going their way in the future. This led to a lot of their greatness, but it could also sometimes be a weakness. Napoleon, for example, was so convinced of his brilliance and ability to win battles that he would frequently ignore evidence that he might lose a battle. In the Battle of Austerlitz, for example, Napoleon only focused on the weaknesses of the Allied forces of Austria and Russia, and even though he was given intelligence of the strength against him was just way too much, because of his reality distortion field, he managed to seize what was possibly one of the greatest military victories of all time. Yet, he also used his selective perception of how things will go at Leipzig and at Waterloo, and in both cases, he misjudged the situation, and he suffered significant losses. So there's certainly two sides to this coin, and we have a lot more to dig into. So hello and welcome to the show with me, Sam Webster, as we continue our quest through all of the cognitive biases. And today we are exploring 7 more, all of which impact our perception of reality. We're going to be talking about a lot of illusions, and things like the placebo effect and the clustering illusion are coming up today. Now, cognitive biases, of course, create confusion and they stop us from seeing reality. And it's easy to label them as a bad thing. Yet, I find it really fascinating to explore the sides of them that drive us to be more ambitious or crazy enough to believe in ourselves and do the seemingly impossible. So because of that, I want to focus a bit more on Napoleon today and have him coming up throughout the episode, as he certainly was a bit of a character, to say the least. He was also really one of the most incredible achievers of history, and a lot of that was partly due to some of his delusions. He was born in Corsica, in fact, which was an Italian island taken over by the French, and he was actually called Napoleone di Bonaparte, and he spoke with the Corsican dialect of Italian. So he actually learned French when he was young and always spoke with an Italian accent, which blows my mind because everything I've ever heard about Napoleon is about him being a little French guy, and he isn't actually French in the way I've always imagined, and we have lots more to learn about him today. Anyway, he rose through the ranks from being basically a nobody who was a semi-Italian cannon fodder officer soldier boy that no one took very seriously to becoming the Emperor of France and the most important person in Europe, which is a pretty incredible set of achievements. And one of the key parts of Napoleon's early rise and later successes was with his fearlessness, which had one too many nusses, but that's fine, and also his luck. He stormed positions where the men all around him were being shot and killed, and honestly, if things had gone slightly differently, just a bullet 20 centimeters in a different place, there would be no story of Napoleon, because he would have been one of those other French or Italian dudes that died in some battle that we've forgotten about. Luckily, he didn't die, and he gained a lot of respect from his fearlessness, and he had the confidence to rally troops and gain support. And the next bias we are going to talk about here is the exposure effect. When you've stormed heavily defended castles with bullets flying everywhere and survived, and you've led groups of men in small battles where you are supposed to lose and you win, you get the exposure effect that you are a winner. Of course, you are going to develop some selective perception if you always win, which gave him more confidence to take on larger campaigns. Due to the exposure effect, you're also going to start feeling a preference for war and battle every time there's an opportunity, because you know that it results in your own advancement, and you might think less rationally about other strategies to achieve the same goal or to just keep things as they are. The exposure effect has also been shown to do really funky things to our preferences. In fact, we'll think a product or a person is more attractive if we've seen them before, even if we didn't notice seeing them. And these tactics have been used by subliminal advertising, where products were flashed without people noticing it, to the point where it became illegal because it made people find products more attractive. And in one really weird experiment, they had women attend university lectures anonymously, and they didn't tell anyone about these women just sitting in the audience. Some of them turned up 0 times, some of them turned up 5 times, some 10, and some 15 times to lectures, and never spoke to anyone. And the ones that attended the most, despite not talking to anyone, being a part of anything, when students were asked how attractive these ladies were, the ones that appeared the most were rated the most attractive, which might be one reason why so many people from history dated their cousins, but there are also important implications in things like politics. If you stick to one message and repeat it, it's a lot more effective than talking about lots of different things. Donald Trump, who I'm not going to talk about again after this, is a master of saying the same thing 5 times and just making himself seem more believable. Like for this year, he is making the election all about immigration, and he just keeps on talking about it and labeling himself as the immigration guy, when his opponent is just talking about lots of different stuff, and you forget what they're even talking about. So we're learning here that what you get exposed to, especially repeatedly, really defines how you perceive something. And there is something cool here, and that is if you don't like something, you might just need to do some more of it first. If you don't like running or healthy habits, you might need to just expose yourself to doing some more of them. You can see how things like a drug habit becomes self-reinforcing as exposure teaches us that it's the solution. But if we recognize that that's what's going on, we can realize that if we want to stop taking the drug and we feel this gap that we don't know how to fill, it might just be that it's going to take some time to be replaced through exposure of things that won't feel like enough of a replacement yet, but will after some exposure. So you can be a bit more patient. And on the subject of patience, we can move on to the Baader-Meinhof Phenomenon. And this is one I'm sure you'll be aware of, even if you didn't know what it's called. You know when you buy a car and all of a sudden you see that car everywhere, whereas before you never noticed it. Or maybe you learn a new word, you've never heard the word before, and then you hear it 3 times in the same week and you're like, this is so weird, I've never even heard this word and now it's everywhere. Well, that is the Baader-Meinhof Phenomenon, and it is an illusion. When you have increased awareness of something, you are just going to notice it more due to the recency effect and selective perception. In fact, your brain takes in so much data every second that it's putting most of that stuff straight into the bin and forgetting about it, which is why you don't notice how many times you see a Toyota Corolla today, but you will notice every time you see the car that you do own yourself. It wouldn't be useful in the slightest if you noticed the amount of time you saw every single different type of car. Like, that is pretty much junk knowledge that you don't have space for in your brain. And I know what you're thinking right now. What about Napoleon? Well, I've got your back here. After his early successes from gaining rank from conquests, he really started spotting conquest and expansion opportunities everywhere he looked. He was like, I am the conquest and expansion guy. Other normal people wouldn't really notice this stuff because it would be like noticing a Toyota Corolla when you don't have one. You just don't notice it. But when you're the empire expansion guy, every time there's a little bit of political instability in a country, and it's the year 1800 and all of Europe is politically unstable, well, you're going to just constantly see opportunities for you to go expand your empire. He'd had stunning victories in Italy and Egypt. He was the first consul of France, and he quickly changed this to becoming emperor so he could continue following his ambitions. When he saw there was a war of the Third Coalition going on, instantly he saw an opportunity to expand his empire. That was his thing, and because that went so well, he saw the whole of Europe as just being ready for his domination. On to the next effect, which is the placebo effect. This is the idea that just belief alone can actually cause a response in our body that changes our health and our performance. Well, as we've heard, Napoleon was a little brainwashed into believing he could do nothing wrong and that he had a bit of a reality distortion field. I wouldn't say that this was without reason. I mean, he is considered perhaps the best military commander of history ever, and his military tactics are still studied today. But it doesn't mean that you aren't a human, and he genuinely would find it hard to look at a situation and see that he could be defeated, which of course made his losses much worse when he did start losing. But anyway, the benefits of his belief was the placebo effect that it created in his troops. Napoleon didn't need to put on a brave face or give a stirring speech about sacrifice for your country because they were going to get defeated. He was just convinced completely that they were going to win, and he'd give a speech about winning, and he'd have real confidence that would influence the feelings, the hormones, the readiness in his men to actually fight with their best strength, and that influenced many of his battles. At the Battle of Austerlitz that I mentioned, he was completely outnumbered by the armies of Austria and Russia. And Napoleon is just like, guys, we've got this. We'll just pull off this rogue maneuver. They won't know what's hit them. We can't lose. I'm too good. I'm Napoleon, if you forgot. And it totally worked. I really do find the placebo effect in general fascinating as hell. It was first scientifically documented in World War II when the surgeon Harry Beecher didn't have enough morphine and found that if he just injected patients with fake morphine using saline solution, patients would actually experience a noticeable pain reduction, purely based on belief. And you'd think that if you're having your leg cut off, you're going to notice a difference, and they did notice, but they still felt better having just some saline put in their arm, which is crazy. In fact, the placebo effect is so strong that it's now a standard part of science that all medical interventions need to be compared to a placebo of the same intervention to see if the intervention really made a difference bigger than just the placebo effect. Because if I do nothing for you and pretend to do something that doesn't actually do anything for you, but pretend, you will still feel better from it. So for a medical intervention to be worth it, it has to be better than a fake intervention. For example, for one knee surgery, they found that you'd have the exact same benefit if they just put 2 small incisions on the side of your knee and didn't give you the surgery, and people would walk away feeling just as good as if they'd had the actual surgery. Obviously, some knee surgeries are very important, but it's crazy that in some cases, it wasn't the surgery, it was just the belief and things in people's brain. And you can do the same things with sugar pills for pain relief or fake sports drinks for improved performance. And the fascinating thing about this, I think, is that I am personally very against the whole manifesting believer achiever nonsense. And certainly when it comes to things like medical interventions, in the long term, eating some diet that someone says might work, but isn't proven medically to work, it isn't going to cure your cancer compared to having the cancer removed. But equally, I don't think you do yourself any favors by being too cynical. Most of the really big achievements in the world relied on having a slightly irrational level of belief to make a breakthrough happen. So if you're outside of non-reversible decisions like not taking a cancer treatment that would lead to your death, well, I think it's then fine to focus on the more optimistic side of whatever you are doing, because even when believing you can do something doesn't mean it will always come true, if you believe that you can't do something, you almost certainly can't. So you may as well be more optimistic and take chances. Because why not? Now, moving on, considering that the placebo effect is where we believe something external will actually change something within us at a scientifically meaningful level, even if it actually doesn't, although it might turn out it actually does, which is confusing. Well, we have the opposite effect, which is the illusion of control, where we believe we can influence the world around us meaningfully when we actually can't. And perhaps just as confusingly, sometimes we can, even though we technically can't. And I will unpack this a little and start with the sensible side that can't be argued with. And this is where there are cases when humans absolutely can't change a single thing that's going on statistically, but they believe that they can. From blowing on a dice to influence its outcome, or even thinking that if you are the one who throws the dice, it's going to genuinely make a big difference to the result, when throwing a dice is a completely random event if you're throwing it properly and not cheating. In fact, scientists have found that if someone chooses a specific numbers of their lottery ticket, they will be willing to pay more money for that lottery ticket than if they are given a random number pulled out a hat, even though all winning lottery tickets are just completely random sets of numbers. There is just something within us that thinks we can slightly bend or predict the randomness of the universe, even though we can't. This is, of course, a factor for financial traders picking stocks who, on average, perform worse than monkeys throwing darts. But there can be some useful or helpful sides of this. So an athlete that puts on their lucky socks each game, well, it's not going to make a difference compared to your other pairs of socks that are the same. And what will make a difference is your training and your physical readiness. But the psychological ritual isn't to be knocked. If it makes you feel more positive and psychologically ready, in the same way that if you listen to a song that puts you in the right frame of mind, that's good. If putting on your lucky socks puts you in the right frame of mind, do it. It doesn't matter that the physical element of it has nothing to do with the outcomes. It still might help you slightly psychologically. And we can go further on this concept. You could look at poker. On the one hand, the luck of the draw is completely random, but your ability to look at the positive side and appear as a threatening person and bluff can allow you to win hands that you shouldn't have won statistically based on your cards. Now, this might not work in the long term if someone starts to realize you don't quite have a handle of the statistics and bluff a lot, but in the short term, it can help you get ahead. And this illusion of control was something that worked in Napoleon's favor in the short term. His belief that he could influence outcomes with strategy, and really the fact that he was Napoleon, it really sort of worked for him for a long time. Once you have a name for yourself as the greatest strategist to ever live, your enemy will have some doubts, even if they are bigger than you, because they'll feel some form of tactical trap might be coming, or some upper hand they haven't perceived will be at play. But just like being a very confident poker player, but not actually understanding the statistics and bluffing too much, in the long run, Napoleon's illusion of control got the better of him. His infamous campaign into Russia was set to be his biggest and best campaign yet. He headed a giant army of 500,000 men, almost 250,000 horses, and he was going to strike into the heart of Russia and get them to turn against Britain with him. And yes, he was warned that Russia is a very vast and cold country that couldn't be invaded, but he was Napoleon. He could outplan, out-strategize anything and anyone, and it didn't matter if he hadn't dealt with that before. He'd done lots of things he hadn't dealt with before and won. But his illusion of control was false. As his army marched further into Russia, the Russian army couldn't face the French and win, but they could march away from them and burn all of the food and supplies in their wake or take them with them. And Napoleon's supplies for his 500,000 men could not keep up with their vast needs. and things really slowed down. It turns out that a can-do attitude will not keep you warm in the freezing Russian winter. Incredibly, Napoleon even made it to Moscow, which had been abandoned before he got there, so there was no fight. He just sat in Moscow for 6 weeks, hoping that he could make some form of treaty saying that he was the winner of Russia. But the Russians were just happy to let the French sit there and starve them out. And after 6 weeks, Napoleon had to start retreating because he couldn't stay there all winter. On the way back, things just got worse and worse. The Russians, who had been too weak to beat Napoleon, now had the upper hand as his army was starved and half of them had died already. And it quickly became a race to survive. Instead of trying to find the Russian army to beat them, they were trying to evade the Russian army so they didn't get killed. Even though they were dying by the day from starvation, from cold, from disease, his initial army of 500,000 men turned into a mere 10% of the initial force that actually managed to make it back home alive. And even Napoleon himself was lucky to get away without being caught. When he started the campaign, Napoleon was the guy that had won some of the greatest battles and campaigns of history. And when he came back from Russia, he was the guy that had led one of the biggest failures of military campaigns in history. So the illusion of control can do some good things, but it can also do some bad things, and you can really mess up with it. Now onto the next illusion, which is the clustering illusion. This is the tendency to see patterns in random events and put them together as a sign. A classic example here is the term hot hand in basketball. This is where a player is considered to be on fire. They're just getting everything right because something's going on for them in that moment. You should just always give them the ball because it's always going straight in. Well, data scientists went through all games of the NBA point by point, and they found that there weren't actually any clusters of point scoring by an athlete that occurred more than should just sometimes happen. Like in the same way that a two-sided coin, it has a 50-50 chance of heads or tails. But quite often you're going to get 3 heads in a row. And statistically, every now and then, you're going to get like 6 or 7 heads in a row because it's just random. And when you're doing a lot of coin flipping, it's going to come up. And if you play a lot of games, there are going to be the odd 5-minute bursts when you just have lots of shots go in. Despite this, there are still lots of people who believe that players have a hot hand in basketball. So an easier example to believe is that in World War II, there were bombs dropped just at random across all of London. It was just carpet bombing. But statistically, some would happen to fall near to other bombs, and there'd be some clusters that you could see. Well, the British public genuinely believed that there was some strategy behind why these bombs would sometimes land in similar places. And this genuinely influenced defense strategies, but the patterns that were perceived were just completely in people's heads. Because it's just human nature to notice a pattern and be like, oh my God, it's a pattern, even when there isn't a pattern. So when it comes to Napoleon, he had a tendency to perceive patterns and opportunities in the political and military landscape that other people missed. And you can see why. He was this seemingly average guy that had spotted opportunities to climb ranks consistently throughout his life, to the point that during the political instability of the country, he'd hustled his way into being the Emperor of France, which is nuts. But his constant interpretation of opportunity, that was a more random event that happened to be very luckily in the right place at the right time in many cases, was not an accurate representation of the real opportunity that was always there. It gave him the relentless vision of opportunities for expansion and the feeling that he alone could navigate and shape the political landscape of Europe, when it wasn't as true as he thought. Back to the basketball example, when you see a player who is having a streak of shots that just always go in and they just appear on fire, the whole team also notice it, and you'll see the player themselves and the team will start believing in it. But then, just as quickly as their winning streak appears, it can go away, and they're brought back to reality. And it was the same for Napoleon. And I think the lesson here is that you should take chances and be more daring than we might think rational, because luck and ability can really combine with incredible results. But equally, we shouldn't get too cocky and completely overstep ourselves. Morgan Housel has a really great saying that the skills required to get rich are completely different to the skills required to stay rich. So perhaps seeing opportunities where there is less of an opportunity than reality is a good thing if it means that you keep taking chances because you have to be in it to win it. But those same skills that help you get there will bite you if you don't change your tactics. Steve Jobs was fired from Apple even though he'd built the company because he was kind of outlandish and rogue with some of his attitudes. But in his 12 years away, he learned a lot of lessons and humility to balance out his creativity and daring with the qualities needed to be a CEO. And when he came back, he was able to turn the company around and stay the leader because he changed tactics slightly from those of a founder who could build something to those of a CEO who could sustain and grow something that was already big. And now we are finally onto our last cognitive bias of the day, and that is the contrast effect. Not only is contrast one of the most useful tools when photo editing to make your pictures look better, it can also be used to make anything you can think of or imagine look better in your mind. And being irrational humans, you probably know that we're going to use this into deluding ourselves that we are more important or we've done better things than we really have, or to catastrophize and think that our life is more terrible than it really is. Hey, welcome to being a human. It is certainly chaos going on in our minds. Anyway, the contrast effect can certainly be used to influence purchase decisions based on the things we compare them to, as we've mentioned before on the show. In fact, people will walk an extra 10 minutes to save $10 on a food shop, yet they won't value their time as worth the same if they could save $10 off a $1,000 suit by walking 10 minutes. Even though it's the same $10 in the same walk, it depends on what you're contrasting it to. In general, it's easy to think something is attractive or large or expensive if you put it next to something ugly, small, and cheap. The illusion that social media creates for users is that all these people we see out there are having a great time, they're smashing life, enjoying their holidays, their job, their relationships, whatever it is they're doing. Whereas the real version of our own life is just less interesting, it's less fantastic, and we feel like our life somehow isn't enough because of the contrast effect. And in fact, this effect can make us unhappy with many things. A group of men were asked to rate the attractiveness of some random women, and half of the group of men were shown the movie Charlie's Angels beforehand. Unsurprisingly, the guys that watched Charlie's Angels rated the real women as much less attractive than the ones that hadn't. And this is part of the pernicious problem of advertising, of movies, of social media. The photo retouching, the perfection that appears all around us but isn't even real. It makes our real lives objectively worse as an experience. And I could go on endlessly about this, to be honest, but the TLDR, less social media, less aspiring to things like race cars and designer handbags, and more hanging out talking to real people about real things. If you can use the contrast effect to make your life worse, you can also use it to make your life better. Instead of doing upwards comparison to things that you don't have that are better than what you have, do the opposite. Do the downwards comparison. And it's kind of obvious. If you taste the most incredibly expensive, brilliant bottle of wine, and then you only have a mid-range wine with your dinner, that wine's going to taste kind of blah. But if instead you taste a really cheapo crap bottle of wine, and then you have a mid-range bottle of wine, that wine's going to taste like a remarkable improvement. So it's worth remembering that if you have your health, a family, a job, a place to live, friends, or your mental faculties, you're doing really well in life compared to that time that you had gastro and you're exploding at both ends because that was not fun and hey, your life is better than that. It's just too easy as humans to get ahead of ourselves and see things in a bad light when we could be comparing all of the amazing things that we have instead and feel really good about stuff. So yes, this is a bit of a fluffy feel-good point to close up on here, but I have no shame on this. And what about little old Napoleon? Well, in his later years, he did use the contrast effect to feel good about himself, so I think we can do it too. Napoleon was exiled to Elba in 1814 and later St. Helena. During those years, he spent most of his time writing memoirs and reflecting on his life. He contrasted the chaos and division across Europe before his reign and compared it with the increased peace and unity of the empire. He really emphasized the stability and order that he believed he brought to Europe. So even in defeat, Napoleon was able to reflect on his achievements using the contrast effect, and that helped him reinforce his sense of legacy as a transformative leader and feel better about things. And this feels intuitively to me like a nice point to look back on and reflect on what we've learned. I've really enjoyed using Napoleon today with this script for two reasons. Firstly, I think it's easy to talk about cognitive biases as just some complete deficiency in human nature that doesn't serve us. But there's an evolutionary reason for pretty much all elements of our behavior, and they do have some benefits. It's nice to realize that navigating the world in a slightly delusional manner can actually increase our success and even our mental health when used correctly. After all, if we try to analyze the 100,000 different decisions we make every day, mostly on autopilot, but instead we try to do that in a hyper-rational way, we wouldn't get anywhere in life. It makes sense that we are stuffed full of assumptions and decision heuristics where we just mostly believe that we're doing the right thing. Otherwise, we'd be almost constantly plagued by panic attacks. In fact, one of the reasons anxiety is so much higher these days are not understanding what is the clear optimal decision. So we end up feeling worse about what we do. And in fact, it's a blessing that we have all these cognitive biases that make so many decisions for us and make us feel good about them. Otherwise, we'd have a hell of a lot more anxiety than we already have. So at least we can be grateful a little bit for these cognitive biases that do make us feel more positive about things, even when they are a placebo. And my second point here, around the delight of some of the things on this episode, is just the fact that I use the story of Napoleon as a tool for learning. I love a listicle as much as anyone, and I feel that in the moment when I'm hearing a list of different ideas that every point made is important and probably sticks around in some way in my mind. But if you listen to a half-hour episode of a bunch of good information, it is hard to remember everything. But humans do really remember stories. So I hope that by tying all of these perception-based illusions into the story of Napoleon, that maybe it will help some of these ideas stick around in your head a bit more concretely, because I feel like for me, it certainly has. Like I mentioned Morgan Housel earlier, he's one of my favorite authors in terms of his wisdom in his writing and just how captivating it all is. His books are truly incredible, but they are genuinely one wise lesson after another wise lesson. And a few years later after reading his books, I genuinely can't remember much of the data or specifics of any of them. I gave his book to my partner and she asked me what it was about. And I was like, I don't know. It's just good and you should read it. That's all I can say. Yet to contrast this with something else, I haven't read Harry Potter in 15 years, but I still know what Expelliarmus means. I know what a Dementor is. I know that the name of the friendly hippogriff is Buckbeak. Now, all of this is a lot of arbitrary data that would definitely be lost on me if I'd been given a listicle about it instead of a story. So because of that, I thought I'd try using a long story across the whole episode instead of using short stories just to emphasize each single point as I go along. And it helped me, and hopefully it helped you too. If you have any opinions or reflections for me on anything from this episode or what I just mentioned, well, I am a student of life. I am trying to get better at everything I do one day at a time, so feedback is always appreciated. I am currently taking calls at the moment with you, the listeners, and it's completely for free on a Wednesday afternoon. There are no requirements at all from you other than turning up. Whether you want to say hi and talk psychology or books, or you want to dig into some deep stuff that you're working on or you don't even know how to deal with it or talk to other people about it, I don't care. I'm happy to chat with you about what's going on in your mind and do the best I can to help. And it genuinely helps me understand what I should do for the podcast better. And of course, you're welcome to leave a comment on any requests that you might have. If you are feeling especially kind today, you can stick a good review on any app of your choice where you listen to podcasts, or drop me a comment. If you do have any friends that happen to be short, angry men like Napoleon, do send them this episode as a warning to never invade Russia. It's how the podcast grows after all. On that, remember that life is too short to have your leg sawn off without some form of painkiller, but in the worst case, just believing you have a painkiller will help. And do with that information what you will. I've been inside too long today and I need to go for a run. Don't forget to be kind to yourself and climb a tree this summer. Failing that, just a big old hug will do, and always smile at strangers. Even if you're a terrible person, the placebo effect might fool people into thinking that the world is full of lovely people, which it actually is. Right, I really do have to go outside, so thanks for listening and go crush your day.